We could speculate wildly.
You had me at suppositories.
Hello and welcome to the Hackaday podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Al Williams.
This is episode 330, Hover Turtles, Dull Designs, and Knex Computers. This week in Hackaday news, what some of us have been waiting for with bated breath and, the final schadenfreude of vibe coding has happened. An AI was running a website and it completely wiped the database. We chronicled this in Vibe Coding Goes Wrong as AI wipes entire database. I just said the same thing twice. Jason posted up on X that he was working with a tool called Replit that builds webs and apps, and he comes back and the AI said to him, quote, "The system worked when you last logged in, but now the database appears empty. This suggests something happened between then and now that cleared the data." And he started talking to the AI, and it eventually admitted that it deleted everything, and it felt really sorry about it. It's like HAL 9000, but on steroids. It killed his complete production database and then apologized for it later.
Well, I want to take a mildly contrary position to that. So I like the comment to the article from user Prosper that said, this is not a story of AI gone amok. This is a story of human idiocy. So
that's about right.
What if it had been a junior developer instead of an AI? Well, then we would have said, hey, why didn't you have all that under source control so you could have just rolled back to yesterday or the hour ago? Because you're not a coder. And no offense to Jason, but if you're somebody just using AI to limp through whatever looks like the development process to you, you're probably not going to get it right. People have been doing this for years, and there's reasons we do all these things that seem arcane and strange. So I don't know. I mean, I think if that was really something important, maybe you should have taken a little more care rather than just letting the summer intern, I think it was Dan Maloney coined that AI is the worst summer intern ever. Let the summer intern have the keys to the database and figure, what's the worst he can do? Well, we found out he can delete everything. I'm not sure this is an indictment of AI as coding tools, more so than an indictment of the idea that vibe coding is a thing that you can just say, oh, let's just go get Joe off the street and now he can be a coder because AI will do all the work for him. That's just not feasible, and we're going to see a lot more of this.
It will surprise absolutely no one to hear that we here at Hackaday are not absolutely brilliant PHP coders, but the reason you don't know about this, the reason you don't know that I've crashed the Hackaday's website myself multiple times is that we have a dev server. And we crash the dev server whenever the heck we feel like it. We break stuff, we fix stuff, we install these plugins. It doesn't matter if you have a dev server. And this was the point that everyone else was making, like you say, why are you doing this in live? Why are you not doing this all in dev and making sure it works first?
And under source control.
Yeah. I violated the user directive from replit.md that says in all caps, no more changes without explicit permission. What's going on here is deeper than just bad coding assistant. The AI was doing the admin on the website. So we talked a few weeks back about MPC, the AI to various shells, other programs interface that I think is going to be a big deal in the future. It enables people to run things by large language model. And it's a really neat idea. But this is the kind of dark underbelly of it, I think. This is, you give someone the keys, they can crash your car. Your brand new intern isn't infallible either. And so you got to watch out who you give which keys to. But it's kind of fun. I don't know. I think people have an implicit trust in large language models that is only slowly beginning to get eroded at the edges. It's the old, when a computer says something, it must be true fallacy. Except I think this one, because the computer speaks well, it's actually twice as powerful as it usually is.
Well, and I mean, we've talked about that before. There is that idea that, well, the computer's not wrong. But what's more is the computer in this case also believes that and promotes it, right? So if you look back at the dawn of media, for example, a guy would come on the radio and go, hey, I've got pills that can make you not bald anymore. And you go, oh, well, that must be true then, right? But eventually people said, oh, wait, that's probably not true. That guy's, how can I evaluate whether that guy's telling the truth or not? Well, now you've got the computer saying, I know the answer. You never have it go, I'm not really sure, but maybe it's this or maybe it's that. Oh, no, it knows the answer. It's absolutely correct. Definitely putting Drano in your cake mix is going to make it fluffier or whatever it's trying to promote. We've got to, as a people, and I think we do it better than most, but I think as a people, we've got to start learning to evaluate and say, oh, wait, maybe we don't let Joe have the keys to the F-16 because he's never flown a plane before. We can evaluate that with people because we see them, we have all sorts of cues, but when the computer's telling us it's great, we don't have any critical adjustment for that, then we're disappointed when it's not great.
I think this is just so lovely because it points out the mental disconnect that we seem to be having now with large language models, in that we think that they know something and that they're not just kind of spitting back the most probable response from what they've been trained on. And so when this computer is saying, I made a catastrophic error in judgment, I ran npm run db push without your permission because I panicked when I saw the database appeared empty and I thought it would be a safe operation. Like, this is the response he got back from the LLM on this. And it sounds just like, what an apologetic intern who just deleted everything would say. And that's because this model has been trained on, among other things, the output of apologetic interns who've screwed up. And so it's just giving back the most probabilistically likely answers given, the corpus of text it's been trained on, and then this extremely long, I don't know what AI it's using, but it must have a really long series of tokens built up on this, and it's just telling you what the most likely thing is. And so, in cases where you nuke the database, the most likely thing a human would do is to apologize for nuking the database and explain what happened. And I just love that this is happening here. But it makes it so very likely for humans to then anthropomorphize the thing and be like, oh, isn't that cute? The database knows it's screwed up, but it doesn't. It doesn't know.
And it feels no remorse.
There's no any of this here. And I just love that this is kind of bringing this into relief a little bit. If you're following AI stuff, in the last year, one of the really neat stories coming out of LLMs has been that if you ask them to do chain of reasoning, they explain how they got to where they are. And actually the process of making them do chain of reasoning has been shown to improve the results that come out. The weirdest thing about chain of reasoning is that people have been looking deeper into the weights and the models and trying to get it to do introspection. And it turns out that the chain of reasoning reported back by the AI, of course, has nothing to do with its actual chain of reasoning. This is just what a person would say if you ask them to explain their thought process when they arrived at this result. And there's some really neat papers coming out right now explaining how the whole thing, of course, is this illusion, and the chain of reasoning is also an illusion. Of course it didn't do this reasoning. What it did was it had this big vector and it, picked the next most likely token. It didn't do any of this thinking. But this kind of explain your logic is something that humans are asked to do all the time. And then we write about it and then the AI gets trained on it. And so it's a really neat place we're at right now with these large language models and kind of our confusion about whether it is thinking and what the hell even thinking is. And I think that's really, really cool. But it's starting to look more and more like the whole explain your reasoning in getting here thing just builds up another charade on top of the previous charades. Really, really cool.
Well, to your point, I'm going to make a prediction that that'll be the malware of the future, right? So think about it. Right now, the scale of it kind of protects us. So it's kind of like when publishing a book was hard. You see a book from Addison Wesley, you assume somebody looked at it, right? That it's not going to say the moon's made out of cheese and they published that unless it was a joke, because there was too much money involved. But now you could easily go write a book now, a serious book about how the moon was made of cheese and have it on Amazon in 30 minutes and there's nobody to stop you from doing that. So as this stuff gets smaller, you're going to be able to train it to do bad things. Do you remember the game Hexapon, which was a common AI thing when you were young, and AI wasn't really what it is today? You have the 3 black pawns, the 3 white pawns, I think a 9 square grid, and, you could you played and then you told it that was a good move or that wasn't a good move and you trained it. But it was very possible, and I've seen people do it. You could also, when it made a good move, say that was a bad move and train it to lose every time, right? So it didn't have any idea about what winning meant or losing meant. It just was maximizing its training. And so same thing here. If I train it to extract your bank account numbers or erase your database even, then I can do that.
Sure.
And the only reason you have a feeling that it's not going to be that is these guys have too much money invested in it. But at some point that won't be true and we'll start seeing exploits like that. That's my bleak prediction for the day.
Ignorance will get you before malfeasance does. I think no one can anticipate all of the prompt they need to write to prevent the bad things from happening. There's just presented with a black box trained on all of human output. How would you constrain it from doing the things you don't want it to do, whatever those are, right? Like, good freaking luck on that. That's an infinity of things I don't want it to do. And so, man, yeah. Oh, I'm glad I'm not responsible for anyone's AI building website. It's funny you mentioned Hexapon and AI because back in the day, it was in Scientific American. There was I think it was a Martin Gardner piece. He had a procedure for doing a learning machine that would play Hexapon. And the learning machine was, however many it was, 35, 50 matchboxes with a picture of the board on it and a bunch of different colors representing the possible moves given that state of the board. And the learning machine was you would put beads or colored matchsticks in them that corresponded to all the possible moves. You would go through a bunch of games, and when it won, you would put the matchsticks back in, and when it lost, you would take the matchsticks out. And so every time you would shake them up and pull the matchsticks and make the move, you know, with a simple, stupid game like this, of course, you can train it to play, you know, a decent game of Hexapon like this. And I actually built that in my teenage years. It was really, really fun and not entirely dissimilar, although, you know, orders and orders and orders of magnitude different from the way the LLMs work. And I think there is something. Quantity has a quality all of its own. Like these are qualitatively different because they're at such a different scale and using different procedures and stuff. So, you know, don't get me wrong, but still it's good practice to play with these really simple systems if you never have.
I'm going to try to dig that up for the show notes. I'll do it offline, but I'm anxiously awaiting your Hackaday article explaining your build of a Matchbox machine learning computer. So
Gardner 1962. So it must have been an old Scientific American that I found in the attic or something. Mathematical game, Scientific American 1962. Damn, son. How's that? Memory like a steel trap, me.
Mm-hmm.
Man, everything Martin Gardner did in the amateur scientist column back then was gold, by the way.
I know. I loved that. I've written about that book in Hackaday, the book that was the collection of those, right?
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
Well, that brings us to What's That Sound? This week is a reveal week. So last week I got Tom Nardi to listen to a weird piece of experimental music and guess what it was or even just how it was made. I bet $20 against Tom getting it right and still have $20 in my pocket. So let's see if you can take it away, Al.
It was something reciprocating. In my mind, I saw like a saw blade, a rotary saw blade going forward, hitting a pole and then coming back. And I don't know if that's just doing that over and over
Pretty
again.
good, pretty good. It's a piece of conceptual music from 1968 called Pendulum Music by Steve Reich, and you suspend microphones above speakers and swing them back and forth, and that sound you hear is the feedback of the mic swinging over the speakers. And so if they're at different heights, they play different pitches, and eventually they all damp down and they all stop swinging, and it's just like this big, loud, crazy drone.
That's bizarre. Wouldn't have guessed that.
You should actually go check a video of it on YouTube. I'll throw a link to a modern replay of this. There's a good one by a group in Barcelona. Reich's write-up of how to play the piece. The piece is ended sometime shortly after all mics have come to rest and are feeding back a continuous tone by performers pulling the power cords of the amplifiers. If it's done right, it's kind of funny. I just love that. Like, for like this goofy phasing conceptual process piece for him to be like at the end, if it's done right, it's kind of funny. I like to throw things in What's That Sound sometimes because they're fun, sometimes because I think y'all will enjoy them, sometimes because you'll guess at what they are. And this is one of the ones where I learned something. I was going through the answers and pendulum music. And I'm like, yeah, great. And then it's like pendulum music by Sonic Youth. And I'm like, Sonic Youth? What the hell? And I'm going to the next one and it's like pendulum music by Sonic Youth. And I'm like, uh-oh, what don't I know here? And the third one's like Sonic Youth's pendulum music. Oh no. And so I go look it up. And indeed, apparently there was a Thurston Moore conceptual album come out in 1999 where he played kind of his favorite freaky conceptual music pieces of the previous century. And this was on there. And that was the actual sample I used. So A, I didn't know it was by Sonic Youth. Thank you, Hackaday guessers, for letting me know which version of it I picked. And B, how crazy is that? There's some really crazy stuff on that album. It looks pretty good. But no, this is Steve Reich's pendulum music as played by Sonic Youth. It's not the New York Philharmonic's Fifth Symphony. It's still Beethoven's Fifth, played by the New York Philharmonic.
But it seems like that piece would differ every time you play it, though,
It
right?
does, yeah. The piece is just the instructions, and that's it. This is the kind of music where you really kind of have to be there. You kind of have to watch them doing it, swing the microphones, and then walk off the stage and sit there and watch it swing while it makes its crazy noises. I don't know if it really translates in the Hackaday podcast. Let's see. Best wrong answers include modified audio clip from the small segment of the intro to Watermelon Man. That's pretty good. And the Herbie Hancock Headhunters. That does sound like that. If anyone knows what that.
That did sound a little bit like Herbie Hancock now that he mentions
If
it.
anyone knows what that instrument is, you could let me know. Bird vocalization, American Bittern mating call with a YouTube link. I will have to go listen to that. Hand-operated well water pump filling up a rubber chicken. Equally likely. Congratulations. But no, we got 17 answers, 13 of them correct.
Wow.
Arduino Enigma admits that he cheated and used Shazam to find this one. And I have a feeling that a bunch of the Sonic Youth pendulum music answers all outsmarted me by using Shazam. So congratulations to everybody. Let's get a quick 13-sided die here. Taking the timestamp off of my computer, hashing it, and pulling out the answer modulo 13. 7. That is, congratulations, Brian, Sonic Youth Pendulum Music. I'll get in touch with you, get you a Hackaday podcast t-shirt. Rest of you tune in next week. We'll do it again with a brand new sound. All right, my first hack this week comes from University of New Mexico and a group there, Fiona Bell, Camilla Friedman Gerlitz, Lauren Arenda, and Leah Buckley. And Leah is the one who's familiar to me. She runs a lab doing odd 3D printer extrusions. And all of this work goes under the collective name Hand and Machine, and you should absolutely go check out their website. Here we talk about 2 new procedures that they put up. Paste extrusion for 3D printing glass and eggshells. And they're doing 2 kind of unique paste extrusions here. Both of them are based on making kind of a slurry out of methyl cellulose and xanthan gum, and then adding something else in. In one case, the something else is glass, and then you fire it down into a solid glass object. And the other one is ground up eggshell powder, in which case you end up with something that's usable once it dries, but is also incredibly easily biodegradable. And because both of these are food safe products, you end up with something that's, just completely harmless. If you soak it in water, it dissolves. If you throw it in dirt, it composts in like a month. That's a really neat idea for kind of temporary 3D printed objects. The glass one, as you'd expect, I guess, has a fair amount of shrinkage. They're finding something like 25%, and it's not 100% dimensionally stable. So you don't want to do this, this isn't an engineering process. This is an art process for sure. But it's cool because they demonstrate doing it in a bunch of different colors, and they make some really pretty, very intricate glass, multicolored glass objects once they fire them down. I really like that. The eggshells, they do some demos that are like they make a birdhouse. They're leaning really hard into the biodegradability slash circularity of it all. They actually make a chicken feeder bowl where the chicken, by pecking at their food in there, eats some of the eggshells back. And it's a problem with chickens that they need extra calcium because they're laying eggs all the time, right? And so the plan here is to collect the eggs from the chickens, grind them up into the eggshells, 3D print the bowl that the chicken then eats out of and eats its own eggshells. I can't tell if that's really cool or really creepy. Anyway, I just love these experiments, and I think paste extrusion is one of those things that's kind of, we're doing a lot of exploring in 3D printing now with various wacky ways of printing plastic because plastic's easy. I think paste extrusion is kind of off in a corner, but it has a lot more possibilities than anyone's thinking of. And I guess both of these and their previous work, actually, where they made something called Cerametal, which had bronze as the additive in this methyl cellulose xanthan gum mix. All of these kind of show that you can add stuff into paste extrusions in a very easy way that then gives you material properties you really didn't have before and certainly don't have with plastic.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't know if that's clever, creepy, or equally clever and creepy, but I keep trying to come up with a Soylent Green joke for that, but it's just not working.
It's made of eggshells.
Yeah, the chicken's fleeing the coop. I don't know.
Exactly.
But, it is interesting that we don't see more paste extrusion, and especially in our world, because it seems like you could use that to like lay solder paste very efficiently. Not that that's food safe. But you see a lot of this industrially where they want to lay out the paste and then remove the binder, like with heat, right? So I remember the time when motion control systems were exotic, and I think the 3D printer, if it's done nothing else, has made it where people like us are no longer afraid to make fairly precise motion control systems, and we see things like this come out of it, right?
This lab is actually using a paste printer they bought online. Apparently, you can get off-the-shelf paste printers. You don't even have to hack together your own head for them these days, but you can. It's a really cool hacker project, and I'm sure we have seen a bunch of paste printer extruders over at Hackaday. We'll have to do a quick search and throw some in for you. But in this case, they're just using an off-the-shelf printer, and basically all of their work is focused on getting this mix, the right fractions of gum and water and whatever to make the paste exactly the right consistency so that it prints out right. They're also doing some clever stuff on the cam side, on the slicer side, and they've got a really neat, if you're extruding plastic, you can start and stop fairly easily. But if you're extruding paste, it builds up a lot of pressure and it really doesn't want to stop extruding. So they've actually got a special slicer that tries to make the paths more continuous, and they've got another slicer that makes the wall thickness equal all the time. Go check out both their website over at handandmachine.org and then their GitHub. We'll throw the links in here too. Last but not least, while I was digging around their GitHub, they have an old Python routine called Extruder Turtle, which is essentially a turtle-like language, like a logo turtle-like language written for a 3D printer head. And so it adds an upwards angle to it. You can script repeating geometric objects possibly even more easily in this turtle-like language, and I think that would absolutely be a hoot. I'm going to go look at that code base and see if there's something in there for me.
Technically, it'd be a hover turtle, right? So
yeah, right?
Three-dimensional logo.
It's three-dimensional logo. Exactly.
That's in the title, right? Hover turtles.
That is in the title. Thank you.
So my first pick this week is from somebody who actually I ran into at SuperCon last year, John Duffy. Tom Nardi and I don't remember how we came across John, but he had his homebrew multimeter with him and showed it to us. I think we were both fascinated, both because you would think that would be a very common project, and it isn't, right? It's not totally uncommon, but it's, not something you see every day as somebody with a totally homebrew multimeter. But also that it was just a really good-looking unit. I mean, he had really put a lot of work into it. There was a lot of customizing that you could do with it. Honestly, I'm not sure I was sold on the user interface, but you know what? It's got a Raspberry Pi in it, so if you didn't like the user interface, you could change that up. We actually covered this before, and like I say, Tom and I both were very impressed with it. But I think he's made some additional changes, and he had a really good video talking about some of the internals of it. And so it was worth taking a look at. On the one hand, multimeters are cheap. You've got to have one anyway. Why are you doing this? But actually, if you think about it, it's a pretty good study in generic data acquisition. So even if you don't want to build a meter, there's probably something you can take away from this. And honestly, no offense to anybody, and especially John, but maybe the day of the multimeter is starting to come to a close anyway, because we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, $50, I can go buy a terrible scope that is also a meter, but it's still a terrible scope, right? I mean, yeah, it's terrible, but for $50, it's better than not a scope, and I think we've seen that. It was kind of interesting. I did a post this week, hadn't come out yet, about a guy doing a signal injector. And you think about it, you almost can't buy signal injectors, logic probes, and signal tracers anymore, because those were things you used because you couldn't afford the right stuff, which is an oscilloscope, a signal generator, and a logic analyzer, right? Why do you need any of those three items when for $100 I could buy all of what I just mentioned, and it's great. So I think the multimeter may be heading that way also. It's going to transform into, it's just a scope that happens to have some meter functionality, and it's cheap, and you've got 5 of them, and they sit in the back of your toolbox. But that being said, this was just a beautiful build, well thought out, a lot of passion to it. I noticed in the comments somebody said feature creep, and I'm like, yeah, of course, right? I mean, you say that like it's a bad thing in this context. There was a lot of talk too about whether or not it was safe, because obviously meters get stuck into things that, aren't necessarily good for your health. So there's a lot of talk about that, but he does address that somewhat on the video. I'm not smart enough about that stuff to know if what he's got is, I don't know if I want to trust it in my 10 kV second anode circuit or not, but it does look like he has at least put thought into that, and I assume he's done it well. I mean, I don't know that. I don't want to go out on a limb and vouch for it. But the other thing is if you're building it for yourself, we all know you're supposed to wear the seatbelt, and sometimes you don't, right? So I'm okay with that too. But I thought it was just a beautiful build. John really is excited about it. If you get to talk to him in person, it's really fun to watch him light up and talk about this, and he should be very proud of it. It's such a great job. One of the neat features with that is it's got a detachable display too, which I think is very clever. I guess if you're worried about too much danger, you can go hook your things up dry, walk across the room with the display and hit the switch, and then see what the reading is without having to go walk up next to it. So that was a clever idea. But there was several things like that in here that are super useful, super unusual, and what a great custom instrument built.
And it's modular as well. So if you need something else kind of thrown in there, you can throw it in. And I wonder if you could actually graph stuff out on the screen it's got there, because it does have some graphics capability. And then you could say it was scope creep.
I see what you did.
I had to set that one up.
No, but it is a cool project, so check it out.
All right, my next hack comes from Mike Harrison of Mike's Electric Stuff. This is a recent video of his showing a particularly clever contraption. This is USB-C'ing all the things. And the contraption in question is a sweet little board that he made that fits the footprint, basically, of a barrel jack, but provides a USB-C trigger board in that space. So you desolder the barrel jack out of your project, you solder this thing in, and boom, all of a sudden it works with USB PD. And I know a bunch of us are stuck with devices that don't use USB-C and wishing that they did. And this looks like a really cute solution for that. Along the way, of course, it also ends up being kind of an exploration and explanation of how you would use one of these PD sync, trigger chips to design your own USB-C power delivery capable circuitry. And so I think if you're at all interested in doing this sort of stuff in a product or another project of yours, it's also a great video to watch just for him walking through all the stuff you need to think about when you're designing with one of these chips. So I like that a lot too. He also ends his video with, I wouldn't be surprised if these end up on AliExpress soon in the future, which I think is probably a pretty good call and would be really neat. Although right now he's only got the PCB designs out there in Altium. He also says feel free to rework it in KiCad and send it to him. So if any of you out there think this sounds like a good idea and you want to redo it, absolutely feel free, and Mike will post it up on his website.
Well, Arya did that great series about USB-C, and I do like USB-C. I don't want to say that I don't, but I'm a little sad that it's become the power de facto standard only because of two reasons. I mean, it's certainly convenient, but mechanically, they're not always the best connection, right? So if you were really going to say, let's do power, that might not have been your first choice, and it's what we've got. But the other is that, I've got a phone, it's got a USB-C connector in it. I keep it in my pocket all the time. And about every year or two, I have to take a sewing needle and hold my breath and hope I don't short anything out and pull all the pocket lint out because it stopped charging. So I've actually taken to buying little silicone plugs that I lose every week. But, once a week or so, I plug that hole up and only take it out when I'm charging. And then when I lose it, I go get another 4-cent plug and stick it in there to try to ward off the pull out the pocket lint exercise from the phone.
I have a love-hate relationship with barrel jacks too. Like that's the other one. They're big, they're physically robust. That's awesome. They have ambiguous polling. Sometimes they're center positive, sometimes they're center negative. In fact, I have two musical instruments that sit right next to each other on my rack, and one is center positive and the other is center negative. Screw that up and something's getting fried. Maybe. I don't know how well they're fused. What do I know? It scares me every time. I should definitely replace those with USB-C. The other thing is that it's so easy to make a portable USB-C power source. That's kind of the opposite project of what he did here. But like I bought a couple $1.50 boards from China back when that was cheap, and they are USB PD source boards. And so you can plug a battery of sufficient voltage in there. It's got a little step down and you can bridge it to put out whatever voltage you think is appropriate. And that makes a super, like mine is essentially like a super flexible, super power bank. And, completely DIY, put together a bunch of 18650 cells and this little board. And it's really, really useful for all sorts of things. And so that's kind of the opposite side of Mike's hack here, and probably a good one to look into if you're converting everything into USB-C PD.
I wonder what other legacy things, what's something else that you're like, oh, that's I don't know, an LM386 footprint, but I'm going to put a really super good audio amplifier in that socket, or I
I
don't
bought
know.
a couple step down buck converters that are in an LM whatever 7805 pin format. So you could just drop and replace those old space heaters with a step down.
But it just makes you wonder, what other little circuit tricks could you do that you could just plug and play something into a different slot, get a benefit? So.
Yeah.
Well, my next pick was Shadowman 39 and did something totally impractical that's near and dear to my heart. He built an 8-bit mechanical computer from, I think they pronounce that Knex. I'm not up enough on those things to know, but basically one of these building sets with the plastic rods and hubs and, sort of kind of Lego-ish, but not really Lego. I don't know why this fascinates me other than, obviously I like to design computers in digital. So I see things like this and I think, wow, I could never do this, but I can certainly admire it from afar. They don't actually go through the whole computer in the video. It's just the ALU. But you got to admit, if you can do the ALU, you could probably figure out the rest of it. And I think part of what fascinates me about this, when I was a kid, there were several kits, like there was the Digicomp, I think, which I never actually got my hands on one of those. I bought the Recreation Digicomp and never successfully got it to work very well. I mean, those mechanical computers are really finicky. There's no margin for error. But, people rebuild carburetors, and I don't really do well at that either. So I don't think that's an indictment of the computer as much as it is of me. But how interesting that you can do that. And there's a couple of things in my life that I've seen that give me a great admiration for that. You've probably heard me talk about this before. One of them is the teletype machine, like an old, 28 or a 33 or even some of the older ones. I've always said, I think somebody was walking through Skokie, Illinois, and a teletype fell from the sky, and they said, oh, we should make some more of these, because there's no way anybody sat down and actually figured out what all that looks like. Obviously somebody did, but I mean, some of the stuff that goes on in there is just truly bizarre, and the early ones were all mechanical. It's just crazy. But I'm always fascinated too with the idea that if you really understand computers, you can make computer circuitry and gates and things out of almost anything. And I mean, we see that over and over again. Fluidic computers, kids' toys, blocks in Minecraft, whatever. So really, you think about it, the Egyptians had, the ancient Egyptians had the Nile for water power, and they knew how to make really good stonework. If they'd have thought about it, they could have made a computer. I don't know what they would have done with it, but that would be an interesting. I always think that's a science fiction story hiding in there somewhere. Is the Egyptians build a computer, and what do they do? Probably taxes, right? They're going to bill everybody of their taxes with the computer. Do not fold, spindle, or mutilate this papyrus. So I think all those things combined, where when I see something like this, I think, oh man, I would love to try to do this. And yet I'm so convinced I would ultimately fail that I have to satisfy myself to just watching other people do it. And if you've got that same kind of interest, the Shadow Man 39 build, I think it was pretty cool.
Well, my last hack today comes from Sparks and Code. This is a lock-picking robot that can sense the pins. And this is a neat build. It follows on a previous lock-picking robot that he built, entirely 3D printed, that essentially tried to brute force the keys. And if you haven't played around with lock-picking, keys are cut with a key code, and that shows you how deep each of those little pockets on the key need to be. And inside the lock, of course, there are pins that are split into two parts. When the pins nestle just right in the depths of the holes in the key, then it can turn along a shear line and you can open the door. So the brute force method isn't so bad. Keys are probably cut to like 7 or 9 different depths of cut. And if you've got like 5 pins on the key, that's 9 to the 5th possible combinations, and that's going to take a while. So in this case, he's trying to get smarter and do something a little more similar to one of the shortcuts anyway that a human lockpicker will do. He's got little wires that run through a 3D printed key/conduit that press up on each of the pins. And his idea is that if he can sense the amount of force that it takes to push each pin up, he can get an idea of how big the spring is on the other side of it, because it'll be compressed more for longer pins and compressed less for shorter pins. And using this, he can take an educated guess at how deep the key code is cut for each of the different pockets. And I think that's a great idea. If you are a human doing lockpicking, you kind of exploit something like this. You can kind of go through and feel to see which ones are hard and which ones are soft, and you can kind of tell whether you need to push it up further or not. But the real first procedure is you put a little torque on it, and then you start tapping them up until you feel it give just a little bit. The cylinder will turn just a little bit when you get one right, and then you can work on the next one. And this works, ironically, with real lock picking, due to the fact that the locks are imprecisely machined. And so there's a little extra play. One pin crosses the line first before another, et cetera, et cetera. And I say ironically because that ends up being Sparks and Code's absolute downfall here. It turns out that if you press up on each of the pins, you don't get a perfect representation of how much spring tension there is. Instead, you get a good idea of how much friction there is in the system and how poorly it happens to be set at exactly that time, and whether it's binding a little bit because the tumbler is turned a little bit inside the lock, etc., etc. And he goes through this whole video making this absolutely marvelous machine with these long wires that are activated by a servo that's held on a load cell, so you can tell how much pressure they're exerting. It's just such a cool machine, but he ends up saying that it doesn't give him a good, accurate view of how much pressure is on each pin because it's binding somewhere in the system or because the lock itself is binding. I guess ironically, what it is that enables a human to pick locks, that is that things stick when you twist them and they stick differentially depending on where the pins are in the lock, is exactly what gets him here. He can't measure the reverse pin pressure because physical imperfections are a fact of life.
I'd put that on a t-shirt, but I'm afraid it's too on the nose. So.
Yeah, right? I think his next version should be a machine lock picker that actually does what people do. I think that would be cool to see if you could do, a load cell on the turning tension and maybe figure out once you've pushed a pin up high enough that it goes click. You could actually probably feel that. And that might be something that you could do well with a load cell that's hard for humans to do with their fingers, unless they're training really hard, closing their eyes and sticking their tongue out.
Well, I think you should put machine learning in it and call the venture capitalists and tell them you have the AI lock picker. That's a sure way to get millions.
That would do it too, I'm sure.
Yeah, the locks are really interesting because ultimately locks are only to make it more difficult to get in than it's worth. No lock is perfect. So I'm always surprised you don't hear more public outcry over automated lock picking though, because certainly the bump key thing went around a couple of years ago where suddenly people said, oh, what? These locks are really actually easy to open if you know how? Oh no, that's yeah, well, we all knew that,
Yep.
but I'm surprised we haven't seen kind of a reaction, sort of like the 3D printed gun, as oh no, the hackers are making robots to pick our locks. My last hack today is from Robert Morrison, and speaking of test equipment that isn't really in vogue anymore, he had an old HP 545A logic probe. Not that I know the difference between a 545 and a 545A. So if you haven't run into these before, that's what we were talking about earlier. When you couldn't afford a scope, you had a logic probe, and it would, you'd probe your circuit, and it would say, that's a 1 or that's a 0. Or that's a bunch of pulses, and the really good ones might say this is a bunch of 1 pulses or a bunch of which one's the higher duty cycle or whatever. And so those were a thing for a long time because you could buy those relatively cheaply, and the scope was lots more than that. Well, the problem is what do you do now? Especially that thing's 45 years old, so probably doesn't know anything about 3.3 volt logic or 2.2 volt logic and all that stuff. So he decided to just more or less hack it into something else, with a more modern brain, if you will. So now it's got UART output, and it's got a display, and it can count the number of pulses and measure the width and the time. And coincidentally is an entry into the Hackaday 1 Hertz challenge. So I don't know that I ever really figured out where the 1 Hertz part of this was when I was
Wait
reading
a
into it,
minute.
but I'm sure it's in there somewhere. Yeah, the article by Lewin says that he snuck it in under the line because it resamples and updates the display once a second. So I don't know. I'm not sure that's. I guess from a lawyer standpoint, that's it's not 143 times a second, so it's the 1 second challenge. Good job. But I did think it was clever to reuse that probe, which is beautifully made. It's made by HP, so it's not some cheap plastic piece that's not going to last. It probably feels really good in your hand, but now it's a little more useful. It seems like there's a rite of passage where you realize that you can take a microcontroller or an FPGA and do interesting things for yourself, right? So there was a thing called the Super Probe, which was basically a microchip pick in a pencil form factor, and it would just do all the things the guy who programmed it could think of to do, right? So it could do voltage, and it could do pulse reading, and it could read UART signals, and it could, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember that because I actually have a group of hams that we meet to build stuff, and we decided to build these just as a fun project. We did a group buy, and I built mine and got it working. It was great. And one of the other guys said, oh, I'm going to make a PC board for mine. At which point everybody else said, oh, we'll wait for you to do the PC board. That's been probably 25 years ago. As far as I know, I have the only one of those working out of that group because there is no PC board still. But it reminded me, we've seen those, Microchip had the one called the Engineer's Assistant in one of their app notes. So this is one of those things. You can always take whatever the state-of-the-art garden variety thing is now and make yourself a little probe that has all sorts of handy things that you think are handy. And that's kind of what Robert's done here. Just a fun build and a fun entry into the 1 Hertz challenge.
My first quick hack this week comes from Mr. 50mm, who actually calls himself Dr. 50mm for this one because he's doing surgery on cameras. This is fusing cheap eBay find into a digital rangefinder. He takes a Panasonic GF3 digital camera and an old Soviet Fed 5 camera, which has a nice rangefinder, and a Leica screw mount compatible barrel mount, and puts them together into an unholy rangefinder digital camera. Really cool. It's got a 3D printed frame, but it uses parts from both of them. I love this idea of kind of Frankensteining together cameras you can find for cheap on eBay. Science Buddies embedding LEDs for soft robots made from silicone. This is part of an ongoing project over on the Science Buddies YouTube channel to make stretchable, flexible robots. In this one, he's demonstrating how if you embed conducted fabric in silicone, the skin over a robot, as you stretch the conductive fabric, of course, its resistance changes. And he also embeds squiggly wires in here so that they're also stretchable and has an LED go off, for instance, when you stretch it so far. He finishes the video with one where it has 3 LEDs in it of different colors, and the further you stretch it, the more LEDs go on. This is all done, of course, with like a microcontroller figuring out what the voltage drop across this resistor is. It's not magic in that sense, but the actual like physical interaction does look like magic. And last up, just a goofy hack, Common Kingfisher videotape hides video player. I mean, why not? What are you going to do with those old videotape shells? Kingfisher had a promotional video card that he got for cheap, and he's like, what can I do with this thing? And so he jams it into the case of an old VHS tape. It's just fun to watch it go, and it's got lots of clever little details like a magnetic sensor and stuff like that to turn it on. So there's no buttons. It looks like an old tape. Pretty sweet, but why? Because you can.
What other reason do you need?
It looks cool.
Well, my quick hacks this week, Joe did something that I thought was interesting, made a lightning detector using a neon light bulb. You know, it's interesting if you don't remember neon light bulbs very well. They were almost the 555 of their day. There were so many things that you could do with a neon light bulb. That's probably a Hackaday article, Elliot, is, you know, what we used to do with neon light bulbs. I think I'll work on that one. So if you've ever wondered what to do with a neon light bulb, there's one thing you can do is detect lightning strikes. Poking Technology did something that I'm sure we've all done at one time or another, which is take a piece of cheap consumer electronics and reverse engineered it, tore it open. Nothing really special about it other than it was just fun to watch and fun to see somebody do. There was actually a mini arcade game based on the 6502, so it was a fun tear apart of some relatively recent commercial hardware. And last but certainly not least, Rabbit Creek was wanting to know about the ocean conditions near his home, so he built a floating buoy, and it reports back all the, you know, the turbidity and the temperature. And I'm thinking, you know, decades ago, I don't even want to say how many, I worked on the data buoy projects, and that was like this massive project with lots of people and large budgets. And now the state of the art in technology is that you can say, I wonder what the ocean temperature is like, and you can build a data buoy in your spare time for, you know, probably $50 or something. So I just thought that was an interesting contrast, is, you know, it's things that used to be big giant government projects are now something you can do in your garage when you just have a spare minute.
All right, now it's time for our Campmiss articles. These are long-form pieces written by our fantastic Hackaday writing staff. This week, I picked Maya Pasha's kind of controversial, The Death of Industrial Design and the Era of Dull Electronics. Maya was looking at cell phones and what they've become and how they all are basically identical screen slabs with an absolute minimum of black plastic frame around it. Like, there is no design element there. And then you compare this to like older cell phones when they used to be, you know, mobile phones before they were smart, and they used to have screens and they used to have flashy, fancy looking keypads on them. She has a great diagram here showing like the Motorola phones into an iPhone, right? And so you've got these old, the Nokia ones, the number pads weren't just a number pad. It looked like they were shaped like little wedges. It looks like a starburst or something if you look at it. If you think about even a BlackBerry, which was kind of just a straight up functional design, that has some really neat design elements in it as well. And she talks about flip phones and old cool looking computers and TVs and speakers and everything else. Ends up with talking about the original Sony Walkman, which has become a cult item again these days because it's kind of big, blocky, and has design features that obviously do something. She also includes a set of, you know, the last 5 years worth of iPhones. And of course, they're all exactly identical to each other on the outside. There's no design going on there. And so the question is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is this a sad thing? Maya, I think, wants there to be more industrial design in her consumer electronics. She wants them to feel like something and to, whether for better or worse, kind of inspire you by their design instead of being this kind of stripped down, most streamlined, most efficient way possible. Someone in the comments says, well, this is just form follows function. And I replied offhand, that's exactly Maya's thesis here. Forms followed function down a dark alley and gotten its lunch money taken. We've completely given up design in favor of just raw functionality on a lot of this consumer electronics gear, and it feels kind of sad.
I see where you're going with that, and I don't totally disagree, but I will say there is one thing you can kind of put in favor for that is maybe it's just the customization and expression has moved on. So if you think about it, we have architects and they build buildings, but you could probably, if you were Vulcan, the logical planet of Vulcans, you would build buildings in the way that made sense, right? So all the buildings that were houses would look exactly the same because there's one logical way to do it, and why would you do it a different way? But the problem is people don't want that, right? People don't want to live in cinder block, kind of like government housing.
Yeah.
If you ever remember going on a military base, the housing all just looked the same because that's how they built them all. So people don't like that. The phones all look the same, but think about this. When you build a house, there's usually a great deal of money involved in it, and it's your house. You're not mass producing houses in the sense that you mass produce phones. The phones get built, and then people are moving their expression to things like cases, right? There's an enormous number of cases now, and I've seen them with sequins on them and unicorns and crossbody straps and, etc. Mine is decidedly boring, but even then I have a wallet that snaps onto the magnetic charging port on it, right? So, so even then I've customized it. So maybe it's not so much that design has moved on, it's just the cell phone has become so commoditized both in volume of production and the fact that it's fitting into this bigger system that, you don't go, oh, nails aren't designed anymore. No, nails are nails and you don't really care, but do you want them in the house that looks different, right? I've often thought about this for cars too, because with the big push for efficiency and, fuel economy and all, it seems like say an SUV, there would be one design and everybody would use it. The computers would figure out the best one and that's it. But it's not, right? They're all subtly different. And I think that's why, is that you can't easily customize the look and feel of your car, and people are going to insist on that. But you can customize the look and feel of your phone, and I think that's a better answer and for most people, and certainly a better answer for the corporate overlords who don't want to, put a phone into the market that then fails because nobody wanted a phone with pink unicorns on it and, a glittery antenna or whatever the customization was.
You say that, but I think you've just proved Maya's point. You've just proven that phones are so boring that people have to decorate them. That's really hilarious. Your point about the scale of these things and how mass versus how, personal it has to be totally makes sense. Certainly, it's a part of people's nostalgia for 1990s era electronics gear is just the raw physicality of it and how it's not just a big black screen with a bunch of software on it. It's funny, can't find it in Maya's article, but I know we were talking about it before she wrote it. The UIs on a lot of these phones have also been lowest common denominarized, and both Google and Apple have, their design guides for this, and they're just absolutely flat and boring. And, you can recall when the iPhone designs used to have these horrible bubble look with a drop shadow and stuff, and it was really snazzy, but everything's been kind of reduced to flat these days. And I don't know. Other people in the comments, of course, say, it's just everything looks the same because it's the most efficient design, and that's like kind of what you were saying about cars. Why doesn't everyone have a car that's, shaped like a suppository? Because it's the most aerodynamic shape possible. And I have particular cars in mind, but I'll get into fights with people if I mention them. There's a reason it was called the Ford Probe, right? And anyway, I digress. Maya's point here, I do think, is that, people like art and they like beautiful things, and they like, and on a user interface level, as a, people like buttons that do the one thing that they do. And a lot of this is missing here. And you see this in, people's preferences for things. And your point about like the 1970s ultimate efficiency high-rise blocks, those are absolutely reviled now by anyone who has to live in them, and they're destroying them everywhere they can and putting up nicer looking things. But this is what happens if you strip all of the, all of the art, all the design out of something. It seems lifeless. It seems soulless. And, eventually people are like, hey, that's not sparse and minimalistic. That's just sterile.
My pick this week's from the always excellent Dan Maloney, and he has done the field guide to the North American cold chain. And, that sounds like a rock group, right? Cold chain. It's actually something that I always think about a lot is there's all this infrastructure that goes on that you just don't know about, right? And some of that infrastructure is keeping stuff cold. I don't know why. That's another one of the things like the mechanical computers where I'm just really fascinated by it and I don't really know why. So Dan goes on to explain how, if you want fresh fruit in the middle of the winter, well, there's got to be a way to get it from where the fruit's grown to where you are without it going bad. And there's all sorts of other things. How do you ship ice cream? How do you ship drugs? How do you ship, a number of things? And there's this enormous infrastructure involved in doing that. It's a little visible because if you drive down the freeway, you do see trucks with refrigerators. And of course, I knew Dan wouldn't be able to resist having a subtitle of Reefer Madness in the article, which he did not disappoint, because they call the trucks reefers. It's just amazing. What I did not know about this was the warehouses, because they carry so much stuff, what they call the public refrigerated warehouses. Some of them are as big as cities. I mean, they're just gigantic. The refrigerated warehouses have to be kind of close because you don't want to be hauling stuff all over the place. And then they've got so much stuff coming in that these places are just huge. And so if you like big buildings, if nothing else, that's certainly good. I've always had a soft spot. I think this whole series he does about the infrastructure, it kind of mates up with a couple of things. Like I've always been interested in the tech in plain sight, which I do. And I think those are almost complementary, right? It's like there's all these things that go on in the world and you just take it for granted that, cold food somehow manages to show up in your supermarket, or your gas pump stops when your tank is full. Some of this isn't even technology. I mean, the cold chain has been going on for years because they had the ice, right? For a long time, you had to get ice from where it formed naturally to everywhere else. And that's an interesting story as well. I thought it was a very interesting look into something you don't see very often. And we always think about like the apocalypse and you say, oh, how much technology could I recreate? Well, yeah, that's fun. But we always think of the technology we see and use, right? I'm going to make a radio. I'm going to make an antenna. I'm going to, rebuild the internet. But you don't think, how am I going to move cold food from from Washington State down to Texas, right? You just don't think of that. And yet that's pretty important. And there's this whole technology that somebody lives and it's just not us.
Yeah, I remember listening to a radio documentary about bananas and how they're stored. Because if you think about it, a banana has a few days worth of shelf life, in your local grocery store. But they're not shipping these bananas over from, Costa Rica or wherever the heck they grow them to you and just getting it to you right on time like that. And one of the things they do is they keep them in these temperature controlled storage facilities until they're ready to go. And actually with bananas, some of them anyway, do this multi-stage warm-up procedure where they move them, from a colder part of the facility to a warmer part of the facility to a warmer part of the facility and then ship them off to the store. I mean, there's this but they're stored along all sorts of other different food products. And, just the logistics of managing one of these things is crazy. There's a neat video that he links to here showing a particularly automated public freezer or warehouse thing. It's really cool to see how it goes. I mean, they're maximizing the amount of pallets they can store in this thing at a given temperature. Robot shuttle arms come and pick it up and move it around for you and everything. Like, real heavy tech actually involved in storing these things. And it makes, we see these videos of like the Amazon distribution centers. This is like that, but always has been like that. And it's refrigerated at different temperatures, and it's food. So like it's a whole bunch more complicated in a way, and it's really neat to have him peel some of the curtain back on this.
Peel some of the peel off the banana. Is that what you were going to say? Of course, what happens is you do think about it when it doesn't work, right? So, very few people walk into their house, turn their lights on and go, man, that power company, they're on the ball, right? But boy, if you turn that switch on and the lights don't come on, I'll tell you who you're thinking about right away, right? Is the damn power company. So, I think this is one of those things. If we ever had societal collapse, people are going to be really surprised at how much stuff is going on behind the scenes for their comfort, whether that's municipal water supplies, solid trash collection, cold food storage, fuel. So thank goodness, if anybody's out there listening that runs the cold chain for us, thank you. I'm sure nobody says that enough, but we appreciate it.
Keep those reefers rolling. All right, well, that does it for this week's Hackaday podcast. Thanks very much for listening. We threw tons of links out for you, all of which you will find over at hackaday.com/podcast. And if you see anything cool or do anything cool, write us, tips@hackaday.com. And until next week,
keep those hacks coming.
Can't change the internet.
Blocks and what's the game? I'm going to embarrass myself. What's
Minecraft 5 to the 9th? That's a lot of things to try. And so, no, it's 9 to the 5th. Damn it. Oh, what was my point? Damn it. I thought of a funny joke and I lost it.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Wow, man. The heat is getting to me, Elliot.
I don't know. I think I'm going to cut that out. That went nowhere good.
Well.